Hey, David Brewster here with another Brewster's Millions of Rants, and this is Guitar for the Practicing Musician. And if you're a certain age, you know exactly what magazine I'm talking about. And if you're a little bit younger, it's okay, but you may have missed, some of the excitement or some of the action from back in the day. And Guitar for the Practicing Musician was in print from 1982 until 1999. And in 1992, it was actually one of the most popular and most commonly bought music magazines on the market. They sold a lot of issues of this magazine. And I know when I was a kid, I discovered it, right alongside Guitar Player and Guitar World. And I was like, wait, this magazine has a bunch of songs and lessons and all this stuff. And it really was kind of, my internet before I had the internet. I learned, lessons, I read the articles. It usually came with a poster that I'd put in my room, and I would learn, songs from the magazine. And it really, really helped me, develop my skills and develop, reading tablature and reading chord charts and scale charts. And especially when I started reading music, I kind of went back and revisited some of those lessons and songs and kind of really noticed, how it was written in the notation. And the magazine itself was very precise. They really accurately transcribe music. So if you've never really read Guitar for the Practicing Musician, you can find, used copies on eBay and Reverb, and there's some other places you can find, back issues. But it's a great magazine. It's a great one just to kind of revisit. If there's a certain guitarist or band that you like that was featured in an issue, buy it, and read it because the interviews were great, the lessons and the songs transcribed were great. And every month there was something just packed in that magazine that would inspire me or push me or motivate me, in different ways as a musician. What I decided to do for this episode is I'm going to discuss the magazine briefly, and then I'm actually going to show you some lessons and material that I kind of pulled from my collection of old, back issues. And the first thing I should probably talk about is John Stix. And John Stix definitely was the head of the magazine, the editor in chief, and he was the driving force, and aside from his editorials and the writing and, kind of working with the staff and really developing a very, streamlined and efficient and very focused magazine, he also helped start, guitar recordings and, sign people like Blues Saraceno, Coven, and a whole bunch of other people. And it's really interesting to see that it started with a magazine and it grew into like a small label. And they definitely helped put, Blues Saraceno on the map back in the day. And I remember, he'd pop up in the magazine. There were advertisements, it had the guitar logo, like on the back of his album and stuff like that. And I always had that connection where I thought, wow, that came from the magazine. About 10 years ago, I had a book, The Stylistic History of Heavy Metal Guitar, and that was through Cherry Lane. And I actually corresponded and talked to John Stix on the phone numerous times when we were putting that book together. And I was, so impressed and so, just shocked. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm talking to John Stix, And I think I even said that the first time, I talked to him on the phone. I was just blown away and intimidated because I knew who I was talking to, and he was so friendly and nice, and we had, some good conversations about that book, and we just talked, about random things too. And I'm sure I had kind of a Wayne's World moment over the phone, where I'm not worthy, because, like I said, I knew exactly who John Stix was. Aside from the transcriptions, the interviews, the poster, the cover, sometimes the cover would inspire me. I do remember having subscriptions, and the magazine would show up in the mailbox. And when I would get the new issue, whether it was, Guitar for the Practicing Musician, Guitar Player, or Guitar World, I mean, that was my education. When I was a preteen and an early teenager, I learned out of guitar magazines and learned by ear, primarily. And, every month when those magazines would arrive, it was like Christmas, and I had new things to read and practice and learn about each month. And I do remember, having a subscription for a few years for Guitar for the Practicing Musician. Also, eventually had subscriptions to Guitar World and Guitar Player as well. But I devoured those magazines. But, aside from the material, the interviews, the transcriptions, the cover, the poster, another big, attraction, of course, were the ads. The advertisements were great. Before we jump into some actual, licks and lesson material, the transcriptions, that they featured each month. It was a good, selection of rock, and there would be metal. Sometimes they'd add blues or some jazz or fusion or classical music, and there was always something, really interesting or different that you could, kind of challenge yourself with every month. And the transcriptions themselves, like there's a photocopy of D, which came from Guitar for the Practicing Musician. Here's Benny Moore's Daydream, which I kind of safely made into a photocopy, just so my pages wouldn't get all torn up or whatever. But there's Daydream, by Benny Moore. And the accuracy of these transcriptions is second to none. I mean, they were so accurate, and you could tell they really painstakingly went through, interviewed the artist, asked specific questions, found fingerings and found, the right parts that they would notate. Here's another one. There's Frenzy, from Racer X or Paul Gilbert. And I definitely remember, just spending endless hours, working with the songs and transcriptions, reading the interviews and reading the magazine itself. And a very inspiring magazine for sure. So once again, if you're not really familiar with the magazine, check out the back issues on eBay or Reverb and order a couple. You can find, like little lots of magazines or individual issues. Now to tap into some actual music and kind of sharing some lessons and ideas from the magazine. The first one I'm going to share here is from Steve Morse, and Steve Morse definitely had, his Open Ears column in Guitar for the Practicing Musician for years, and a lot of those articles that he wrote turned into a book, and I did recommend that book in one of the Overdue Book series episodes on this same series from the Brewster's Millions of Rants. But this is about rhythm, and he's kind of talking about, practicing with the metronome, and I've used that information in that particular article with students for years, and it was very inspiring for myself, and definitely a lot of students that started working with practicing scales and using the metronome. They found it very valuable too, and it was a great article. It was from the February 1991 issue. The next nugget from this magazine that I'm going to share here, this is from Joe Satriani, and Joe had a Guitar Secrets column in the magazine for many years. And this is from his Modal Arpeggios article, and that would have been, the November 1988 issue. And you can also find this actually in his Guitar Secrets book, which I've talked about this book on this channel before. And this actually compiles a lot of the articles and lessons that he wrote for the magazine. And you can see right there in the back, there's the logo. So if you find any books out there that have the Guitar for the Practicing Musician logo, grab it. No matter who, is in the book or how it's featured, pretty much everything associated with the magazine is great. So that's a great book to check out. And this lesson, he's basically talking about modal arpeggios. So I'm just going to demonstrate a couple of the ideas that he shared. And he started with Lydian in the key of D. So he was talking about taking the Lydian mode or scale and transforming it into an arpeggio. So D Lydian would be right here. D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, and C sharp. What he was talking about doing is arranging it like an arpeggio instead of like a scale like that. So he was taking the root, the third, the fifth, the seventh, And then he started stacking the ninth, the sharp 11, and the 13. And if you do that, instead of this, you'd have something like this. And you can see there's your root, here's your third, your fifth, your major 7. There's the ninth, there's the sharp 11, and there's the 13, that B note. And it's really cool to hear how that arpeggio sounds. It does sound like Lydian, even though you're technically playing an arpeggio and not the scale. And you can find some alternate fingerings for it. You can put it way up here. But I really like that concept of taking this and transforming it into this. And he also did that with Mixolydian too. And there we're going to basically have, you know, the root, the third, the fifth, and the flat 7. And then you're going to grab the ninth, the regular 11, and the 13 up there. So that would be this. There's your D, you know, F sharp, the A. There's C natural, E, G, and B. And there's your, you know, root, third, fifth, the flat 7, ninth, 11th, and 13th. And you could refinger that, you know, something like that too. But that's a really interesting concept to explore, and you could, you know, make some of the extensions, you know, tap notes. You could race across the fretboard and connect, you know, arpeggios and scales together. The next concept I'm going to share here actually comes from John Finn, and John Finn's a legendary, you know, instructor and guitarist. You know, has taught at Berklee for a very long time. Has some great books. You know, he's written for magazines, various magazines over the years. But he wrote for Guitar for the Practicing Musician too, and this came from what, the January 1996 issue. And this is his magic number sequence. And this is a lesson that definitely kind of opened a door for me, and then I've used this with students over the years too, and it opened doors for them as well. And this is dealing with modes. And you know, in the lesson he kind of shared a fretboard diagram that only had 3 strings, and then it showed, you know, 7 different scale fingerings. And at first I didn't really understand what it was for or what it was. I didn't really thoroughly read the article, for one thing, which was the first mistake. But then when I actually sat down and thought, okay, I want to see what this is and what he's talking about. And when I read the article a little bit more carefully and, you know, kind of ran through some of the examples with my guitar, something clicked. You know, it was like, oh, wow, I think I see, you know, something different than how I did before I really absorbed, you know, this concept in this lesson. So I'm going to share an image that I kind of made to recreate, you know, the visual image that he had in this lesson. But really what we're going to do is we're going to lock into 1 octave, you know, scale fragments or shapes. And then you can basically put those anywhere on the fretboard you want. So these start with the root. They're all beginning with the root note. And, you know, they come from 7-note scales, you know, the major scale and the various modes that come from the major scale. So there are 7 different scale fingerings, you know, for the major scale. And I've talked about that in other episodes, you know, from Scales and Tails and some other lessons, you know, on this channel. But, you know, there are 7 notes, there are 7 different fingerings. But we're going to lock into the one that begins with the root. And to start with, we're going to start with this. And you can see that's, you know, D Ionian. There's D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, and D. And you could also play it like this. Right? That's kind of more like the Mel Bay, I guess, fingering for it. And then here's the 3-note per string fingering. So what we can do is take that fingering, and that's the most popular or common, you know, Ionian fingering on guitar. Now there are 6 other fingerings, you know, or positions for it, but that, you know, starting from the root, that's very, very common and very popular. It's a good one to kind of start with. So So right there, you can basically, lock into that shape, and then you can move into the next octave and kind of recreate the same fingering you just played. And right there we had to kind of shift, differently on the B string because of the way the guitar is tuned. But you can see it's using the same fingering movement though. Whole step, 2 whole steps on the first 2 strings and then a half step at the end. And there's the same pattern, whole step, whole step, whole step, whole step, and a half step. And once you kind of see what we're doing, then you can change that to Dorian. And we're just going to basically lower the 7th, and we're also going to lower the 3rd. So there would be D Dorian right there. And you can extend that to another octave or another location. And then Phrygian, Lydian, mixed Lydian, and Aeolian, and the dreaded Locrian. The important thing here is you're seeing, a 1 octave kind of fragment of that scale, and you can basically change the root, the note that's not circled on this chart that I'm getting ready to show. You can put that anywhere. You could, start on the low E string, you could start on the G, you could change it to a different key, of course. I just locked into the key of D because that's what we were using, in the Satriani example. But, you could change it to A major or E or whatever tonality or key you want to put it in. But the important thing is you're locking in to those very common fingerings, Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and of course Locrian. Now, the magazine actually had kind of an official, spokesperson or the face of the magazine. I mean, they did feature, Steve Vai and Satriani and Eddie Van Halen, and it's like this kind of cast of characters that they always, kind of featured. But George Lynch, definitely, from Dokken and Lynch Mob, he popped up in the magazine all the time. And of course, he popped up in Guitar World and, Guitar School and some of the other magazines too. But he was always in guitar for the practicing musician. And they'd have, transcriptions from Dokken and or Lynch Mob. They would have interviews, extra like bonus lessons. And this is from the February 1988 issue. But in that issue, they ran this, Guitar in the 80s series ran a transcription of the song Dream Warriors, which at that time, it was, extremely popular. But it shows, like the rhythm parts, the solo, and it kind of breaks down, stylistically, and specifically what George was doing in that song. And this is going to be the final lick from the guitar solo, like that crazy tapping lick you hear George do. And it looks like this. That part. So slowly we've got this. It's kind of based around D Dorian, and we're doing this. It's a really interesting sequence that George tapped into, pun intended. But if we take the tap notes away and just look at what the left hand's doing, you'll have something like this, and it's based out of D Dorian, like I said earlier. those tap notes. Kind of reminds me of Red Beach a little bit too, even though that's technically, a little bit, a few years before Rev hit the scene. That's going to wrap this episode of Brewster's Millions of Rants with Guitar for the Practicing Musician, and it should be pretty obvious that I'm, a big supporter of the magazine. I was a long-time reader, when I was younger. And I was, rather upset and kind of, brokenhearted whenever the magazine disappeared. And that was technically, 21 years ago now that it's been gone. But you can definitely find, back issues online available on eBay and Reverb and other, auction sites like that. And I highly recommend anybody that's out there that's not really familiar with the magazine, or maybe you, read the magazine, but you've lost, issues, or you've lost, some of those, lessons and transcriptions, pick up, place some bids and kind of, order some of those back issues and check it out, because it's a great magazine. Even though it was written and put together a long time ago, they just put a lot of care and detail, and you can really tell when you read one where it's like, wow, this is a great magazine. And there's a lot of great magazines out there, but this was definitely a classic magazine, extremely popular. And I still bump into people constantly that talk about this magazine. Do you remember that issue that had, Vito Bratta on the front, or it had, Van Halen or whoever? And it's just something about those issues that kind of lock into your memory, and you never forget, a certain song or a lesson or an interview. It just kind of is forever remembered and kind of locked in your memory banks. So anyway, leave some feedback and some comments. Please subscribe to Late Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more content and material. Thank you.